Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
We begin with the war in the Middle East. Today marks 1 month since the Hamas attack in southern Israel that set off the conflict. Now the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says more than 10,000 people have been killed since the fighting began on October 7th. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is rejecting calls for a ceasefire.
There will be no ceasefire, general ceasefire in Gaza without the release of our hostages. As far as tactical little pauses, an hour here, an hour there, we've had them before. I suppose we'll check the circumstances in order to enable the goods, humanitarian goods to come in, or our hostages, individual hostages to leave. But I don't think there's going to be a general ceasefire.
And Prime Minister Netanyahu tells ABC News Israel could have security control over Gaza for an extended period. Israeli military spokesman Peter Lerner tells Bloomberg Radio the goal of the war is to dismantle Hamas as a governing authority and a terrorist entity.
Of course, we understand that that goal is a very expansive goal, and it will take time. And so the operation itself, the war itself, is an open-ended war. We don't have any hourglass counting the minutes until we end.
And you can listen back to our entire interview with Israeli military spokesman Peter Lerner on the Bloomberg Talks podcast.
Well, Nathan, back here in the U.S., the civil trial continues in New York against Donald Trump. It was a fiery day one on the witness stand for the former president, and Bloomberg's Ed Baxter has the story.
Trump yelled at the judge, said he was biased, and the court was a fraud.
This is a scam, and this is a case that should have never been brought.
And Attorney General Letitia James says she got what she needed.
At the end of the day, the documentary evidence demonstrated that, in fact, he falsely inflated his assets.
And Bloomberg's Patricia Hurtado says she's never seen anything like it.
He was claiming that I've done real estate for 50 years, and as a developer, basically, I have a right to just declare magically what something's worth.
Daughter Ivanka is on the stand Wednesday. Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
Okay, Ed, thank you. Now, Donald Trump will not be participating in tomorrow night's Republican presidential debate in Miami. 5 candidates will. They are Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, Senator Tim Scott, and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. Former White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney says Trump's decision not to participate may have repercussions.
I think it may come back to haunt him when Joe Biden, assuming Biden's the Democrat nominee, has the ability then, with good reason, to say, oh, Donald, you didn't debate in the primary. I'm not debating you in the general. And Trump would be desperate for a debate head-to-head against Biden. Biden would be desperate for an excuse not to do one.
And former Trump White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney says Nikki Haley is the one with the most to gain from this debate. Mulvaney was on Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew. You can catch the program 1 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg Radio or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, Nathan, before we get to that Republican debate tomorrow, voters head to the polls today to vote on some key issues. Ohio residents will decide if access to abortion care should be enshrined in the state's constitution. It'll be closely watched nationally as a gauge of a key issue ahead of the 2024 presidential elections. And in Virginia, Republican Governor Glenn Younkin is campaigning hard for his party to hold the state house and reclaim the Senate majority. GOP victories could line Younkin up as a potential alternative to Donald Trump as the party's 2024 presidential nominee.
Well, Karen, let's turn now to the markets. We're watching shares of UBS. They are higher by more than 3% in Europe. The Swiss bank, which took over Credit Suisse earlier this year, reported stronger than expected client inflows. We get more from Bloomberg's Guy Johnson in Zurich.
We are getting some stabilization in terms of client money, particularly in the wealth management division. That is really important. So they've managed to stabilize that, and that maybe gives them the opportunity to start to kind of accelerate things here a little bit. But these third quarter numbers are basically just bridge numbers. All we're waiting for are the full year numbers, and at that point, we're going to get a strategy update. At that point, we're going to get a clearer idea of where Sergio Mossi, the CEO, and the rest of the team are going to take this combined entity.
And Bloomberg's Guy Johnson says overall, UBS posted a quarterly net loss of $785 million, its first quarterly loss in almost 6 years.
Well, staying in the banking industry, Nathan, Morgan Stanley's James Gorman, who's preparing to step down as CEO at the end of this year, says he will vacate his post as chairman by the end of 2024. Gorman made the comments in an interview at a Nikkei forum in Tokyo. Ted Pick, a co-president and 3-decade veteran of the firm, will be elevated to the top role in January.
And turning to the U.S. economy, Karen, it is too early to declare victory over inflation. That's the view from Minneapolis Fed President Neil Kashkari.
We're making progress. The job market remains strong. The unemployment rate is still quite low at around 3.9%. So overall, the fundamentals are healthy, but we haven't completely solved the inflation problem. We still have more work ahead of us to get it done.
Speaking of Fox News, Minneapolis Fed Chief Neil Kashkari adds he's nervous about declaring victory on inflation too soon.
Well, in corporate news, Nathan, it was once a high-flying startup, and now WeWork has filed for bankruptcy. The company said it had struck a restructuring agreement with creditors and would streamline its rental portfolio of office space. WeWork's collapse is the culmination of a years-long saga for the company, which was once the biggest office tenant in Manhattan.
And Karen, Bloomberg News has learned SpaceX is on track to book revenues of about $9 billion this year across its rocket launch and Starlink businesses. SpaceX is projected to rise to around $15 billion in 2024. The figures represent a rare look into the finances of the Elon Musk-led company, which sells commercial space on its reusable rockets, as well as internet beamed down from a constellation of satellites.
All right, Nathan, thanks. Time now for a look at some of the other stories making news around the world. For that, we're joined by Bloomberg's John Tucker. John, good morning.
And good morning, Karen. The U.S. government's debt interest bill has now soared past $1 trillion. The story in this report this morning from Bloomberg's Jeff Bellinger.
Bloomberg analysis shows annualized interest payments on the U.S. government debt pile climbed past $1 trillion at the end of last month. That amount has doubled in the past 19 months and is equivalent to 15.9% of the entire federal budget for fiscal year 2022. The worsening metrics may reignite debate about the U.S. fiscal path amid heavy borrowing from Washington. That dynamic has already helped to drive up bond yields, and it led Fitch Ratings to downgrade U.S. government debt in August. Jeff Bellinger, Bloomberg Radio.
The Supreme Court today is taking up a challenge to a federal law that prohibits people from having guns if they're under a court order to stay away from their spouse, partner, or other family members. The Federal Appeals Court in New Orleans struck down the law following the Supreme Court's Bruin decision in June of 2022. Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds officially throwing her support behind Florida's governor for the Republican presidential nomination.
Ron DeSantis is the person that we need leading this country.
An ABC News Ipsos poll shows if the Republican Party nominates someone other than former President Trump, more Republicans say they would be more likely to turn out and vote on Election Day. Talks with striking Hollywood actors are ongoing after the union rejected what the studios called their last, best, and final offer. The strike started in July. Netflix co-CEO Ted Sarandos says he's hopeful an agreement will be reached soon.
We're in the business of telling stories, and that's what we want to do every day. So it has grind to a halt for a few months, and so we're going to try our best to get things up and running and get the output back up for our fans, too.
Ted Sarandos with Netflix spoke to Reuters. Elon Musk's company, Neuralink, is seeking a volunteer for its first clinical trial. Is looking for someone willing to have a chunk of their skull removed by a surgeon so a large robot can insert a series of electrodes and super thin wires into their brain. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker, and this is Bloomberg. Karen.
All right, John, thank you. Well, we do bring you news throughout the day right here on Bloomberg Radio. But as John said, you can now get the latest news on demand whenever you want it. Subscribe to Bloomberg News Now to get the latest headlines at the click of a button. Get informed on your schedule. You can listen and subscribe to Bloomberg News Now on the Bloomberg Business app, Bloomberg.com, plus Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update. Here's John Stashower. John.
Karen, Monday Night Football to cap Week 9. Chargers at the Jets, and LA's Darius Davis ran a punt back 87 yards a minute 45 into the game. Chargers went on to have 8 sacks and crushed the Jets 27-6. Both teams are now 4-4. The Celtics are 5-1. Their first loss of the season came in overtime at Minnesota, 114-109. The Sixers are 5-1. Joel Embiid 48 points in a 146-128 win over Washington. The Wizards are 1-5. Steph Curry scored 34. Golden State won at Detroit 120-109. Bruins keeping the hot start. They're 10-1-1. They've beaten Florida twice. They were stunned by the Panthers in the playoffs last season. Boston won 3-2. College basketball is underway. A lot of blowouts, including number 1 Kansas winning by 43. Second-ranked Duke won by 38. Third-ranked Purdue won by 53. But Michigan State, ranked 4th in the country, stunned in overtime lost to James Madison. Michigan State's longtime coach Tom Izzo's nephew is an assistant for James Madison. 3 baseball teams have new managers. The Cleveland Guardians hired 39-year-old Stephen Voigt, just recently retired as a player, spent last season as a low-level coach in Seattle. He replaces the retiring Terry Francona. Craig Counsell leaving Milwaukee after 9 years with the Brewers, but staying in the NL Central. He's the new manager of the Cubs. The Mets' new manager is former Yankee coach Carlos Mendoza. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports.
From coast to coast, from New York to San Francisco, Boston to Washington, D.C., nationwide on SiriusXM, the Bloomberg Business app, and Bloomberg.com. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager. It has now been 1 month since the deadly Hamas attack in southern Israel, and the retaliatory war in Gaza shows little sign of slowing. The Israeli military says it has Gaza City surrounded and is moving closer to the city's center as it carries out operations from the ground and air, while the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says the death toll from this month of war has now passed 10,000. For the latest, we're joined by Bloomberg News Israel government and economy reporter Galit Altstein. Galit, good morning. We are 1 month into this war. Given what we're hearing from Israeli leaders in the political and military spheres, what could month 2 look like?
Yeah, so actually, we've been hearing Prime Minister Natanyah tonight. He speaks to ABC News in an interview. He references the talks of a possible ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, and he says that it's totally dependent on the release of all Israelis being held hostage by Hamas. However, he does say that Israel could allow tactical pauses for humanitarian purposes. He says, an hour here, an hour there, quote unquote. And he explains that, in his opinion, a ceasefire would hamper the war effort because the only thing, so he says, that works on these criminals, as he refers to Hamas, is the military pressure that Israel has been exerting. So, but we also hear Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant speaking today. He doesn't give a very specific wide frame for the war moving forward, but he does say it will take more than a week or two. So we can at least read into what he says is the fighting going on for several more weeks.
The fighting itself for several more weeks, but what comes after? What comes as far as the change of leadership that Israel is looking for after it achieves that goal that it set out to dismantle and destroy Hamas?
So I think that is still a question that remains to be answered, and I do not think that there is a clear answer also for any Israeli officials or other officials who are involved in some sort of talks or back-channel talks on this matter. It is a complicated issue. If I go back to what Netanyahu said last night, he didn't discuss who would be ruling or who would be leading Gaza in the day after, but he did say that for an indefinite period after the war, Israel would like to maintain and will want to maintain an overall security responsibility in Gaza, suggesting that it will maintain that role even after the fighting in the territory ends. So that does not mean that Israel will occupy Gaza and will rule there, but it will definitely want an arm and a leg in the security responsibility in the Strip.
You mentioned the Prime Minister Netanyahu talking about tactical pauses in the fighting. We heard from Secretary of State Antony Blinken over the weekend in his whirlwind trip talking about humanitarian pauses. Is there really a difference between those two ideas?
Well, I think when you speak about humanitarian pauses, like Netanyahu said himself, you speak about very brief pauses. He said an hour here, an hour there, while ceasefire is a much wider concept that basically doesn't even seem possible now, in the sense that there are a lot of Israeli troops, thousands of Israeli troops on the ground in Gaza, encircling Gaza City, fighting there, and the wider ceasefire, an overall ceasefire that would see fighting completely paused for a longer time than an hour or a couple hours here and there doesn't seem possible as long as so many Israeli troops are in the ground and there's so much combating going on on the ground.
We've also heard Israeli leaders say that there's no humanitarian crisis in southern Gaza. From what we can tell with the situation on the ground, does that square with what we're seeing?
So, look, we're saying, first of all, we're still seeing that the Israeli army saying that it continues to operate a safe corridor even today for 4 hours towards Wadi Gaza. So that would mean people still moving from northern Gaza to the southern parts. And the Israeli army publishes documentation today of residents leaving the Zaytun neighborhood. That's a neighborhood in the southern part of Gaza City, waving white cloths at tanks, meaning they want to say, we're innocent civilians, let us through. And the army is doing that. And we also saw yesterday the Egyptian border did eventually reopen for the evacuation of foreign nationals and dual citizens, and also a handful of injured people. We do not know the exact numbers, but that did happen.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Today, your morning brief on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed at 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, Sirius XM Channel 119, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.